So we've seen how plants can grow in their vegetative form. Vegetative growth involves the organs we've seen before, stems and leaves and roots. And vegetative is usually contrasted against reproductive. And just to clarify, reproductive, of course, we're talking about sexual reproduction in the flowering plants. That involves pollen and ovules producing seeds, and other kinds of reproduction like asexual or vegetative reproduction are reproduction in their own right, but they're not typically referred to as reproductive in this sense. So we're looking today at the growth that produces the tissues that are going to produce seeds. We're going to focus in on the seed plants and specifically the flowering plants. So flowers and how fertilization can happen in these flowers. Our starting image here, this is a ginkgo plant. This actually is a gymnosperm, so a non-flowering plant and a non-fruiting plant. And it's a little deceptive sometimes if you don't know what you're looking at. It's a broad-leaved gymnosperm. That's not too common among the gymnosperms. And it also produces these seeds that we have to call them seeds. They look a lot like berries or other fleshy fruit, but they're actually just seeds. Details for another day. So looking toward the growth that's going to be called reproductive, plants, as we've seen, are kind of simple when it comes to the number of organs they can make. So we saw above ground in the shoot portion, we've got just stems and leaves. And flowers are pretty simple in their own right, I suppose. When it comes time to transition to produce flowers, that is a big shift in how this plant grows. But it ties in with what we've seen before, as far as plants growing from their tips. So you'll notice that the reproductive regions that I've highlighted on here, there's a pretty clean transition from the area I've highlighted in green, which is vegetative stems and leaves. And then there's a clean shift right here. And after that, you don't really see leaves. There might be some small leaves in that region. And then it's a cluster of flowers. And that's the tip of this shoot over here toward the tip of this shoot. Different branches have at the same time become reproductive, and they're all producing flowers there. This is one way to do it at the tip of a growing shoot. Another way to convert is to have your vegetative growth only at the base of the plant. And then when it comes time for reproductive growth, to start a stem proper that's going to go far away from the ground and also have your reproductive structures on there. So it's got some leaves. These are called bracts or inflorescence leaves, but they're much different than the strictly photosynthetic leaves that were produced in the vegetative state. So a big transition at the base in this plant. And then over here on the right, another example of sort of independent transitions at different parts of the plant. So we'll see how it's important to kind of synchronize this growth. And we'll actually focus quite a bit on the signals that plants key into that tell them when it's time to change from vegetative to reproductive growth. So it's a matter of changing at the growing tips, changing the kind of growth that happens at those tips. These are three examples. Of course, there'd be plenty of other examples, but I think this covers some of the breadth of ways that plants convert into their reproductive forms. We can't talk about development in plants without covering this plant. This is the model organism, Arabidopsis thaliana. This is the plant that's been studied the most when it comes to genetic controls over anything in plants. It's kind of a weed, but it's received a whole lot of research attention, so we can talk about things pretty definitively when we talk about this plant. So it's got a well-defined life cycle, for example, here, number of days proceeding through its growth. And a portion of that growth is vegetative, so up to about 39 days as we have it here. And then in between 39 and 45 days, the growth shifts quite a bit from these leaves produced around the base to a stalk that comes above the ground, and it's going to bear the flowers and later the fruits. So flowers develop into fruits in the flowering plants. And so you can see that in the whole plant. And then over here, this is just a diagram of how the leaves, if you took each individual leaf off and picked it off of the plant based on its age, we've got the older leaves, the more recently produced, toward the right, and the younger leaves, the original leaves, toward the left. You can see there's some change over time. There's an increase as this plant is kind of getting its nutrients about it and able to produce bigger leaves. Then it's kind of in the biggest part of its vegetative growth here. And then the transition kind of shifts from vegetative away from vegetative into reproductive. And so this investment in leaves that do photosynthesis goes down, and the investment then shifts to producing flowers in this reproductive phase. So you can see it in the form of the plants. You can also see it in, if you're looking at molecules, there's a lot of enzyme and developmental changes behind the scenes. So when we're talking about reproductive tissues, I mentioned a lot that we're talking about flowers. And I think it's just easier to cover flowers here. Similar processes happen in other land plants, and we're just going to focus a lot on the flowering plants here. They get a lot of research attention, and they have a lot of diversity, so it's worth covering them, I'd say. So when we talk about flowers, flower we're going to break down into 4 floral organs. So we saw in the vegetative tissue, we had 3 organs, 3 kinds of organs: the roots, the stems, and the leaves. And just flowers themselves have 4 kinds of organs. They are ancestrally, basically, they're modified leaves. So you can see kind of working your way out or in from the outside. These are floral organs proper that I'm highlighting right now. These are called the sepals, and they're the outermost floral organs. And in this plant, there are 5 of them. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they're matched in between the petals that are white, a little more familiar to you maybe. So 5 sepals, 5 petals. The function of the sepals largely is for protection. These are concealing the plant, the flower, while it's in a bud. And sometimes they also protect in the fruiting stage. They're often just this green kind of leaf-like structure, but the pattern of how they're produced, they have their own shape. They're definitely something different than a leaf, and so they're actually properly belonging to the flower. Sepals, petals, probably familiar to you. These are the often showy features for animal traction if pollination is helped by animals. Inside of that are the stamens. Those are the ones on the stalks here with the kind of fuzzy tips. Stamens are the male organ for developing and dispersing pollen. So they have that kind of grainy look to them. Those are the pollen grains on the outsides of the anthers. And then to the inside, this green round bit here, this is an ovary. That's belonging to the carpels. So carpels, you might also be familiar with the term pistil. So if you've got one of these in the center, we can just call that a pistil, or gynoecium for the female portion of this flower. The big part here is where the ovules are held. That's going to become the fruit. And those ovules are becoming the seeds, and these are the styles and stigmas. So they're also kind of lightly colored, but those are the part of that is going to be where the pollen lands and it actually grows its way in to the ovules there to accomplish fertilization. Now, within the reproductive part of the plant, plant really can't just make flowers. It's got to support those flowers and separate them and so on. So parts of the inflorescence, this region that's got all the flowers, we call it an inflorescence. Part of that is going to be just stem again, and then the leaves I mentioned before modified into these bracts. So often quite small, like little scales or triangles, but still leaves in their own right. And you might notice from this image that the flowers are produced in the axils of those leaves or bracts. So we've got stem, bract, and then flower coming out. Here we've got a bract and a flower coming out of the axil of that. So some of the principles we've seen already with respect to phyllotaxis, how organs are arranged, some of that is still going to apply to how the organs are produced within the inflorescence. Okay, so there are stems, there are leaves, but they're different. In almost all cases, you can pretty easily distinguish the reproductive part of the plant from the vegetative part of the plant. So I mentioned the parts of the flower. I'll go through these rather quickly again. Just a different kind of flower here, but same structure as we highlighted before. The sepals toward the outside, they're in between. So the center of the sepal is in between these 2 petals. Petals, I'm sure you're familiar with. White again in this plant as well. Stamens. Stamens have a stalk called the filament, and then this top part is called the anther. The anther is where the pollen is actually produced and distributed from. And this plant's different from the one we saw before. This one has lots of separate carpels. So you can see there's a zone, quite a circle in the center, and it's a little bit out of focus, but in there are a bunch of separate carpels. So these can be fused together, they can be separate. A lot of variation we don't really cover in this class about how flowers can be put together, but interesting stuff if you ever have time for it. This term here, whorls, is often used to describe these floral organs, how they're arranged. So in the context of phyllotaxis, so how leaves are arranged along the stem, we saw that whorls are, whorled phyllotaxis is a situation where 3 or more organs come from the same place along the stem. So we see often in flowers that these 5 sepals, 5 petals, things like that, they're all coming out at the same location, basically, the same level. So these are all producing kind of an even display of 5 petals, all attached roughly at the same place there. So they're whorled. That describes their arrangement as 5 basically attached at the same level. They're attached together. The stamens are attached basically at the same level, sepals and so on. So that's where this term whorl is used. So sort of a whorl of organs of the same type is how you would describe it. Going back in time, I think it helps to understand how flowers came about. So flowering plants, as we've talked before, are very successful on the world stage. They're the most abundant plants in the world today, most diverse into the most different kinds of habitats. They've got a lot going for them, and they've got a lot of reasons for their success. But one of the big reasons for success is their association with animal pollinators and this ability to have a flower that advertises the sometimes offering nectar, sometimes offering pollen as a food source. They're advertising to animals. And so having the petals there for attraction, having the reproductive organs together, the stamens to distribute pollen, the carpels to receive pollen, all a good, useful structure that's ended up being a really big advantage for the flowering plants. So this is a fossil known as Archaefructus. So you might be familiar with the animal fossil Archaeopteryx. That's the first bird, or the ancient early bird. This archae term means early. So Archaefructus is early fruiting plant. And this is a reconstruction of it at the right, along with an image of the fossils themselves. And what they've reconstructed is sort of a zone here of female reproduction. So these would be equivalent to carpels, and they're kind of showing you seeds within. They sort of look like little beans. And that's one plant that actually has a fruit resulting from a single carpel. So collection of bean fruits up here. And then farther down, these are, would be, I guess, primitive stamens. So pollen distribution in these structures here, and they're lower down. And we don't see really anything that would be petals or sepals. So with this fossil, you kind of have to use your imagination and fill in the gaps. But what it does show us is an arrangement of organs that reflects what we see in a flower. So the center zone is the female reproductive organs. That's what we see in a flower. The center is the carpels. Just outside of that, or just below that in this case, are the stamens. And outside of that, now we're down to leaves. So in this fossil, we don't really reconstruct anything that really looks like petals or sepals, but you could maybe fill that in with your imagination and say, well, you could then modify other leaves to become showy and become your petals, other leaves to become protective and become your sepals, and so on. As a fossil, just a little disclaimer, this is not necessarily the first plant on its way to becoming a flowering plant. It's one really charismatic fossil that we have, but could just be a relative of the group of plants that became flowering plants. So always a little bit more mystery out there. So I'll mention here just the order: carpels, stamens, pre-carpels and pre-stamens.